something chewing on it, like a bunny rabbit or a caterpillar. And then we switched and thought about what happens with fungi and bacteria. And so, and then of course we ended up with the goats in the tree, which I don't know how the plant's going to deal with that, but definitely mammals attacking the tree. So I'm sure they are trying their best to defend themselves. So this topic or this research area of how plants are defending themselves, the more they got into it, the more they realized how sophisticated plants are with their ability to very, in a very detailed way, determine who's attacking them and then respond appropriately to that particular attacker. And so and they didn't think plants were that sophisticated. It really spawned a lot of different research looking at, how sophisticated are they, and kind of trickled out from not just how they deal with being attacked, but just some other ideas of plant behavior. And so there's been a lot of really interesting research going on, looking at the plants, looking at the mycorrhizal fungi, of course, that interact with most plants, and how plants behave with each other. Through the mycorrhizal network, they now know that there is a lot of communication going on in forest systems, that each plant is not just this isolated organism, but they're part of a community where they can do a lot of communication, chemical communication. They've even been showing that plants can cooperate with each other, and are looking at even are plants conscious and intelligent. So there are a lot of different papers. There's been books. That's the cover of a book on the right there, looking at different aspects of plant behavior and even plant intelligence. So it is an exciting time to be a botany person, because there are a lot of ideas out there that used to be considered, like, oh, we wouldn't even think about that for plants. Plants can't do any of that. And now we're realizing that, oh, yes, they can. And they just do it very differently from us in many ways. But when you get down to it, some of the ideas that you can think about, like, plants have their own way of hearing, for example. When you think about what is hearing, it's just vibrations, vibrational energy, and they can pick up on that. And so it's kind of hard for humans to think this way because we're so human centric, but plants have their own versions of being able to sense their environment and can then have a very sophisticated response. So these are some books, and most of those that I put on there, those book covers, they're inexpensive and they're really interesting, and they're not a ton of jargon. So if you're interested in reading more about this, I would encourage you to check some of those out, maybe ask for a Christmas present or something. And then these last couple slides are looking at, a lot of what we've been talking about are the secondary metabolites that the plants are making. And we're saying how these secondary metabolites can be toxic to organisms that are chewing on them. And it's like, well, how come we're not getting poisoned by all of these? And certainly we can be poisoned by certain things that plants are capable of making. But I just wanted to point out a couple of ideas that, when they study when you eat certain foods, you're, often told that, oh, it has good antioxidants. And, I grew up learning, oh, eat your broccoli. It's really good for you. It has antioxidants in it. That's really good for you. And when you think about it, though, when they actually did research on this more carefully, they're like, well, it's actually the broccoli contains toxins that stimulate our body, our physiology, and it is triggering a very mild adaptive stress response in our body to that. And it has a particular secondary metabolite called sulforaphane in the broccoli, and that can activate a stress response in our body. And then that triggers our own antioxidant enzymes to get up and running. And so it's a way, the broccoli itself, yes, you are getting some good antioxidants from the broccoli, but that's kind of a minor thought. It's more that the secondary metabolites are triggering a mild stress response. It gets your antioxidants enzymes up and running to try to deal with any free radicals and things like that. So when they study broccoli, they're like, yeah, it does have antioxidants, but it's not sufficient. It's not the main way that you're getting help from broccoli. Let's just put it that way. And so if you're interested in your own health and physiology of what's going on, you should check more deeply into that. But I've had students in the past get a little concerned that, all these secondary metabolites we were talking about, you know, they can kill caterpillars and, moths and all that. How come we're not getting sick from it?
Well, do you want to see how caffeine is for bugs? I don't see anyone here slowing down their caffeine intake.
Yeah, exactly.
It just takes a lot more to kill a person.
Yes, and dose makes the poison, right? Yeah, I remember we had tobacco plants growing in, well, just one actually. We had one tobacco plant growing in the greenhouse, and I think they were white flies. And we were studying, they were crawling on the leaf, but they must have chewed some of the tobacco leaf, and they started like they were walking across the leaf like they were drunk. And it was the caffeine, the nicotine intake from the tobacco that was, because nicotine can mess with the nerves. And so, yeah, but they're tiny little flies, and they had enough to make them look drunk, but it was more of the impact. Yeah, that they're poisoned. So, and then very interesting research going on currently and for the last many years, looking at how all these secondary metabolites we keep saying they're good for us. And it's like, well, why are they good for us? And so this is just a little blurb getting into, um, it's also the idea that a lot of these secondary metabolites benefit the microbes that hang out with you in your gut, in your digestive system. And it's actually their ability to act on those. So the polyphenols, for example, feed the microbes in your gut, and then they break down those polyphenols, and then the products they release are actually really good for you. And so there's this idea that you have to think about not only the human physiology aspect, but also the microbial partners that you have in your digestive tract. So here, this is from the paper showing how if you ingest a lot of polyphenols, I don't know if you've heard about that, the polyphenol idea, that's a really hot topic right now with regard to human health. They're saying polyphenols are really good for us. And so they're trying to show that, we don't really break it down. Like we don't have a great way of breaking it down once we ingest polyphenols, but the bacteria do. And then they produce products from that, and those metabolites then get into our circulatory system and are good for us. And so they're saying that all these microbes, because of their ability to eat the polyphenols, so to speak, and alter them, that the products are then really good for us, and it can help with our overall health. So they're showing benefits on the liver, reduced fat, heart health, all of that. So I talk a little bit more about that when I teach general microbiology, because we do look at the beneficial microbes that hang out with humans and how they're impacting us. So that they've known for a while that most phenols we don't really see in the human bloodstream straight, and that's because they've been altered by the microbes, and it's still good for us overall. So this is just a little bit more information about that. So yes, they are important for our health, but they're also, it's a partnership where the microbes that hang out with us are also benefiting it from it. And then we get products that they make from it, which is good. Okay, so don't panic. All these secondary metabolites, they won't poison you, at least the ones we've been talking about. There's plenty out there that can hurt you, but
Careful of that Panera lemonade.
the what?
The Panera lemonade.
Panera lemonade.
Basically, like your entire daily dose of caffeine in one drink. So people thinking it's regular lemonade, but get more than one.
Oh no. So they didn't tell people that there was a bunch of caffeine in there?
They just said charge, so people assumed it was like a cup of coffee,
Ah,
not, triple that.
super duper, yeah.
So good. It's like they're like hesitant because it's like somebody did die.
Oh.
Sugary and caffeinated and beautiful. You just gotta know you're having that much caffeine in the milk.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, you got to know what you're ingesting, that's for sure. Why is this? Okay. All right. So the next topic, I posted the slide set in Educat. So we're getting into stress physiology. And there's a lot of stresses on plants. Always, this time of the semester, we're all feeling stress, but certainly plants also have their own version of stress. And when you think about the definition, so the estimated yield of field-grown crops. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is impacting mostly agricultural crops because we end up eating those. And so we need to think about what kinds of stresses are messing with the ability of getting enough food to feed everybody. And so stress defined is an external factor that exerts a disadvantageous influence on humans or the plant. We're going to use some terminology. Stress tolerance is one. That is where the plant has some ability to cope and tolerate whatever the stress is that we're thinking about. And then there's, and we're going to focus mostly on abiotic stress right now because the last topic we were really focused on biotic. We will also see that some plants can not only tolerate, but they'll acclimate. And so we'll think a little bit about that. But abiotic stress is, ooh, that's really blurry. Things like high temperature or cold, flooding or drought, salinity, radiation, all kinds of different chemicals that have been sprayed onto them or the soil. And then we're going to not really focus too much on biotic right now. This one's not so blurry. So this is looking at what is going on in the plant under these different parameters of stress. Water deficit, you can see now we have to think back to water potential and the idea that when you have so water potential equals psi sub B plus psi sub S. So of course, when you have water potential going very, very negative, that generally means the plant's under severe drought. Can cause all kinds of problems. You can see the impact that it can have on the plant. It really does mess with the plant's photosynthesis. And, every living organism on planet Earth needs water. So you start to deny that to the plants and they're definitely going to suffer. Salinity also messes with overall water potential because it really impacts your psi sub S component, right? If you have a bunch of solutes, and then you start to see a negative overall water potential. And again, that can cause all kinds of problems. Here's some other abiotic stresses again. We're going to start in this slide set, we're going to be looking at pollutants and salts. We're going to look at those conditions, and then we will look at some of these others in subsequent slide sets. In general, when you think about stress, you have this idea that they call acclimated, which some people will just say the plant got hardened off or acclimated. A lot of gardeners will say the plant was hardened off. but the fancy plant fizz word is acclimated. And this is where you can train your plant. Plants have a version of memory, and they can remember that they've been exposed to, like, say, cold temps. So in the spring, when you start to grow your garden plants indoors, you plant your seeds, it's April, and you get them as to a little seedling stage, and then you're like, well, in a couple of weeks, I should be able to plant them out, but not quite yet because it's still kind of cold. Well, you can acclimate your little seedlings by putting them outside for a little bit each day, and then just keeping, keeps extending how long you put them out there each day, and then bring them in. And as you do that, they are getting acclimated. They're starting to increase their tolerance to that cold that they're getting exposed to. And then eventually you'll be able to plant them in the ground outside. Around here, it's always best to wait till May, early May, before you do that. But that is a good trick. And then adaptation is the idea that through many generations, these plants have gained resistance. So it's something that is like genetically altered in them that allows them to resist over many generations. So you're thinking about a longer term idea here with the word adaptation. It's through the process of natural selection and adaptation. So much of the work that has been done on abiotic stress has been with crop plants because of the importance of that to us, and because so many farmers and growers have to deal with all kinds of abiotic stress. This is some data showing some of the major crops grown here in America. And you can see the big orange part of each of those bar graphs, and that is a clumped idea of all the abiotic factors. So we're looking at everything that can hit crop plants that are grown outside, drought, flooding, heat, salinity, all of that. And then biotic, you can see the purple bluish boxes, they're much smaller amount. The losses are due to the biotic, and then the average yield of the crop plant per hectare. Here's another set of data looking at global impact. So this is not just here in America, but you can see again that you have a variety of issues. Salinity is a big one. This green box is the post-harvest losses, where once you harvest the plant and put them in storage and they're waiting to be shipped out, they can get all kinds of issues going on there. And then, of course, global warming, got to think about that as well. Here's another pie chart looking at, this one is looking at how insurance money that got paid out to growers due to issues. And in this case, it was during periods here in America where there were 2 years back to back of serious drought. So you can see a lot of payments went out for drought. And actually not much in that time span, not much for diseases, but you can see here the green 27% with precipitation, flooding, storms. And then here's some other data. Top 5 weather-related causes of loss, and drought wins hands down. So 56 billion. Yep, 56 billion. 56 and a half billion dollars. Wow. Well, that's over, a 20-year period, but yeah. So either not enough water or too much are the top 2. So the swing in water availability.
Well, the second one could also just be from, I know that in areas where there's hills and stuff, it washes all the seeds out
Yeah,
and pollutes the entire field.
yep, exactly. Yeah, time permitting, we will talk about too much moisture. That actually has some interesting impacts on not only the plant, but then the microbes that hang out with the plant in the soil. It can be a double whammy for the plant. All right, we're gonna look a little bit at pollution, including air pollution. I'll mention just a little bit about that, and then we're gonna mostly focus on soil pollution. So carbon dioxide levels are rising. We know that through global climate change, that we do have that situation. Carbon monoxide, of course, is very deadly. A lot of sulfur volatiles can be problematic, including sulfur dioxide. That's a big one. And then NOx just means there's a lot of nitrogen containing volatiles in the air that can be a problem. And ozone, even though we know that we need ozone high up in our atmosphere. You know, I grew up hearing about the ozone hole, and we got to close the ozone hole. That's true. High up, you want ozone. You just don't want ozone down here where, yes, you don't want to be breathing that and get exposed to it. It's bad for any organism, including humans. And so of all of that, ozone down here at Earth's surface is actually the most damaging out of this particular list. And one of the reasons for that is when ozone is reacting with other molecules in the atmosphere, it tends to produce reactive oxygen species to high levels, which can be damaging because those are considered free radicals. I know that air purifiers, like I bought an air purifier with all this forest fire smoke going on. And this particular air purifier has the option of running ozone on it. And it's like, why? But then you read the manual and it says very clearly, if you turn the ozone on, leave the house. But they don't say exactly why. So I just thought that was interesting.
Why would you include it to begin with?
Well, they claim it because it gives that fresh air smell. Like it smells like a rain. After rain, you get that fresh air smell.
It's like, I guess, you know, if you had a lot of people over, there's all the air germs.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
it does that.
But the problem is if you have anything else alive in your house,
Right.
like I have a
Plants.
bunch of plants and house plants, so
And
it's like,
animals. That's so my advice is if you buy,
Okay.
I mean, it's a good air purifier. It's got a HEPA filter and all that, and I like it. I just never turn the ozone on. So just be aware, you're not really supposed to be doing that. Yes, yes, then it would. But again, people shouldn't be present when you turn it on. You know, it just nothing, no organism should be present. Oh, blurry again. So here we have just a simple reaction trying to show how ozone can get created. If you're curious, O3 is ozone, and so HV is light, so sunlight energy. And with the NO2, you can get that breakdown, and then it reacts with oxygen. So if you're curious, and then the issue here is that ozone can, of course, enter through the stomata. You know, when the stomata are open, they can get in through that way to the plant. Plants aren't totally like vulnerable. They do have mechanisms in play to try to deal with some of the air pollution. So here you're seeing sulfur dioxide coming in through the stomata, and they're just trying to show, you don't need to memorize this or anything, but it's just trying to show that they can convert that sulfur dioxide to a less dangerous molecule, which is hydrogen sulfide, which is another gas that they can then have exit their stomata. And so there are mechanisms in play. The plant isn't totally at the whim or at the mercy of all of these pollutants. As far as what's going on in the soil, take your pick. There's all kinds of pollutants going into the soil system and have been for many, many, many years, centuries. And probably the most well-known are the ones I'm listing here and the ones that are causing a lot of problems. I have in the notes section what these stand for. So TCE is trichloroethylene, PAH is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, MTBE is, I never know that one, methyl tert butyl ether, PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls, even TNT. There can be remediation of that, believe it or not, even though it's an explosive. So these can be degraded by plants and or the microbes that hang out with the plants. I didn't put on here the idea of microplastics and PFAS, but those are the newest hot topics, of course. This is historically what has been of most concern within the last few decades, probably since the 80s, 1980s. But of course, recently now we have the idea of microplastics that can be added onto this list, as well as the PFAS. And
stress. There's a aware of it that doesn't happen.
pretty much, it seems that way. And it's in the air, you know, and in the water, in the soil, yeah. Inorganic, there's a lot of inorganic pollutants that come from actions during agriculture, mining, military. Inorganic pollutants really can't be degraded because they're in their most simple forms. However, that doesn't mean the plant can't deal with them. Probably one of the most famous ideas is that the plant will sequester the pollutant in a way that makes it least harmful to the plant. They can also, especially with their root systems, they can also, I guess stabilize is the right word. They can stabilize the pollutant in the environment so that it won't be as reactive. And then, of course, I think we've all heard about heavy metals being an issue. And so if you're wondering what's classified as a heavy metal, this is the list of the ones that are most concerning. Which are inorganic. So a lot of the soil systems that plants grow in will have both organic and inorganic pollutants that they have to deal with. And too much of anything can be bad. And when they are exposed to these different pollutants, they have to try to deal with it. And they can potentially take that up into their body. And if they do, it's very often that you'll see the reactive oxygen species kicking in. And in a negative way, where it can be too much, too harmful, and the plant will start to suffer for it in many ways, including decrease in photosynthesis. You get enzymes not being able to function correctly. Membrane structure can get disrupted. Ion balances in and out of the cell can be a problem. And when things get really bad, you get cell death. Apoptosis is cell death. Many problems with heavy metals. One other issue, when you get high levels of certain heavy metals, it can create problems because they can mimic nutrients that the plant actually needs. And it can get quite complicated when you look at the science of this, but basically they've done some nice work with, we all know plants need calcium and magnesium at fairly high doses, but some of the heavy metals have been known to kind of replace these when the heavy metal concentration is big enough in the soil. And if you replace calcium or magnesium with a heavy metal that really doesn't belong there, it can be problematic. So for example, calcium binds to that calmodulin protein, but if you have a certain heavy metal that is very close to calcium and can mimic it, then the calmodulin protein can't do its job, and its job is a lot of signal transduction pathway mechanisms. So again, the cells stop functioning correctly, and won't be able to respond to their environment. Magnesium, just one simple example, magnesium is part of the chlorophyll molecule. So if you have something, a heavy metal that can mimic that, and chlorophyll tries to get made with that heavy metal in place of magnesium, you probably won't have a chlorophyll molecule that's gonna work very well. And so they're investigating these ideas, like once the plant takes them up, if they can't sequester them, what else could go wrong? And luckily, they have, through their studies, they've found out that a lot of plants have developed methods that can either block the uptake of the ions, so they never get brought up into the plant to begin with, or they're able to quickly pump out the heavy metal or pollutant. And so it'll come into their cells and tissues, but they're able to pump it out. It usually requires energy to do that, though, ATP energy to do that. And of course, if you use a lot of energy devoted to that, you can't use that energy for something better, like growing and completing your life cycle. Once they take up a pollutant, they actually have, many plants have the ability to tolerate many of these different pollutants. And it can be a very active mechanism, like they will have enzymes that can, especially the so-called antioxidants are usually enzymes that are very active at breaking down these pollutants. So that's, a very direct attack on the pollutant. Another strategy is just try to kind of hide it away, get it away from important areas in the cell and compartmentalize it. So very often they'll stuff things into their vacuole that can be toxic to other parts of their cell, like their membrane or their DNA. And so the vacuole can serve as a kind of a housing for the toxins. They'll also, a favorite strategy of a lot of plants is that they'll put the toxin at the tips of their leaves. So they'll sequester it along the tip of the leaf or the margin, the perimeter of the leaf structure. And that can be one reason if you see your plants have brown tips. It's not the only reason, though. It's not necessarily a pollutant. It could be just due to too much salt. Some plants also produce phytochelatins, which are molecules. There's a couple of different versions that can bind to the pollutant. And if you can successfully bind the pollutant, it tends to inactivate the pollutant and make it so that it can't, it's kind of like compartmentalizing in a way. It's just latching onto it with a chemical that makes it so that the pollutant can't run amok and cause problems. So for example, there's some plants that have been studied. When they discovered this, it was kind of jaw-dropping because they found some plants are what we call hyper accumulators. So not all plants can do this to this extent, but there are some hyper accumulators that can accumulate tremendous amounts of pollutants. So when they look at experiments with these plants, 20 to 30% of their dry weight of the plant is, in this case, it was cadmium and arsenic. Yeah. So, I mean, that was jaw-dropping. When they figured that out, they're like, what is this plant doing? That it's allowing it to, this particular study was cadmium and arsenic were in the soil at very high levels. And it was kind of a serendipitous thing. They discovered that there's heavy metals in this patch of soil, and yet there's these plants growing there, these wild plants. And they're like, what is going on here? So they took samples of the plants and were able to figure it out.
So is that because of the plant, or because of the soil by accumulating so much?
Yeah, so the plants growing in this soil that had really high levels of cadmium and arsenic, they kept bringing it into their tissues and it didn't kill them. That was what was so stunning when they figured out that this patch of soil was so heavily polluted with these heavy metals, and yet the plants looked healthy. They were green, they weren't overly stunted. And so they were very curious how this could happen. And they discovered that they just have some really good ways of sequestering the metals and chelating the metals so that the metals couldn't cause any detrimental effects. So in these hyperaccumulators, they had sulfur-containing amino acids in high levels or sulfur-containing organic acids. And so what would happen is that would chelate the cadmium or the arsenic. And then phytochelatins are typically, when you look at all the phytochelatins they've discovered so far, they're a small string of amino acids put together. So it's a polypeptide, but it has sulfur in it. So in general, you see this theme of either sulfur containing amino acids that can chelate, or maybe a string of sulfur containing amino acids. And then they call those the phytochelatins. So this is just a couple of visual ideas. So aluminum citrate. So again, aluminum is not good for any living organism in excess. And so you can see in this case, the plant is actually using citrate as a chelator. And you can see how the aluminum is bound up with the chelator. And then down figure B, we're looking at a phytochelatin. We see a string of amino acids that have sulfur. And that's the area, the sulfur site is where you're going to have the metals binding to that area. So plants aren't totally at the mercy of all these pollutants. They can tolerate, they can adapt. Most of the pollutants that are being actively explored and like, how can we get this better? A lot of it's in the soil. So of course they've thought a lot about this with, well, if there's so many soils that are polluted and we know plants need soil to grow, I mean, can we use plants to remediate the soil? Do they have the ability to take up these pollutants to make the soil better? And then either depends on what you're thinking about with the plant, like if they take up the heavy metals, or pollutants in general, I should say, if they take up the pollutants, can they convert it? Ideally, the best situation would be, especially with the organic pollutants, is to take in the organic pollutant and convert it all the way down to water and CO2. If they could do that, that'd be awesome. Or if they could at least convert it to something less dangerous. And there's been a lot of effort on that. And if you focus in on the inorganics, very often, like the heavy metals, for example, they're often in the soil in a charged form. So they're cationic, typically, or anionic, and that makes them hydrophilic, and they can be released through cation exchange that we learned about when we looked at mineral nutrition. And once they're dissolved in the water, then they can be brought up by the plant. And so that's generally what we see with the heavy metals, for example, and the other inorganics, is that they're brought in through a cation exchange, releasing them into the soil water, and then the roots take them up. If there is a pollutant that's more hydrophobic, then they tend to be bound to the soil particles and don't easily release from that. Like they don't have a cation exchange issue going here. You can't do that. And so when scientists are like, okay, if we have a hydrophobic pollutant and we want the plant to try to interact with that and take it up, you need to do a little something. Often what you do is you apply a bio or a surfactant, like a scientist could go in there and actually apply a surfactant to the soil. So a soapy-like mixture. Or we also know that especially microbes are really good at producing so we call them biosurfactants, because the microbes are actually synthesizing them. Because a lot of these pollutants that we, can kill us or plants or other organisms are actually, microbes want them. It's a source of nutrition for them. And so they can produce their own biosurfactants to get access to them. So for example, a famous example is rhamnolipids, which are biosurfactants that bacteria can make. They'll excrete it out. That releases the hydrophobic contaminant, and they'll take it in and break it down, and they use it and mainly as a way to generate some ATP. But, you can also add it. I don't know if you've ever followed any of the release or the oil spills, but that's one of the first strategies they'll do is they'll release soapy they call them surfactants, but yeah, it's
It's
basically soapy substances. And it can help. It's not the only thing that they should do though. There's other. And then of course there's volatile pollutants that, that's a special thing you gotta think about, because if it's volatile, that could be brought all the way through the plant and it may never get changed at all. It could go out of the plant and still be dangerous and create air pollution. So,
I didn't even consider that.
yeah. So there's a lot to think about if you are in the business of trying to remediate pollutants, especially in the soil. And if you want to use plants for that, you have to think about a lot of different things. So you have to know your soil, of course, anywhere from clay that has very tiny particle size all the way to sand, which has very large particle size. That definitely impacts the pollutants and how well they bind to the particles. Do they, wash through to the underlying groundwater? So you definitely have to know all of that. And we know that most soils are slightly acidic, and thinking about how does that impact the pollutant. And then we know the negative charges. So we have to think about cation exchange for some of these pollutants, especially the heavy metals. So you've seen this figure before when we're thinking about the idea of you got to get those cations off the soil particle through exchange. And then once it's in the soil, water, then great, then the roots can take them up. So we've talked about that. And so they know that that's happening, and they're thinking about these ideas of how plants interact with the soil system. And so the fancy word for using plants to remediate is phytoremediation, PHYTO, anything like that means something plant-like. And this has been a thing for many, many decades. And the other, I guess you can't really, phytoremediation is definitely a thing. I mean, they talk about phytoremediation, but you also have to think about all the microbes that hang out with the plant, because it's usually a combination of those that's doing the job. It's not just the plant, it's the plant and the microbes in the soil or the microbes in the plant. And so bioremediation was the first idea that was proposed on how do we clean up our pollutants, because it's microbes. And scientists have known for a long time that microbes are really good at breaking down these pollutants to less harmful substances. And now with phytoremediation, using plants can be very advantageous, but it's also really, you are thinking about all the associated microbes as well. So it's kind of a dual effort. Some scientists will use the word rhizoremediation. Rhizo is just trying to hone in on thinking about all the microbes that hang out on the roots in the soil. And they're saying that when you have this plant microbe partnership, you have a lot of interaction where the plants are cultivating and recruiting certain microbes, especially if they're in a polluted site. They're going to want to hang out with microbes that are really good at breaking down the pollutants. And so they will often recruit those microbes. And so it's this effort of the plant is kind of gathering its army of microbes around it to help out with the process. And so this image is looking at the different ideas here when you have plants in play for how to remediate. So I'm going to go through some of these. So when they use the word phytostabilization, you can see they're showing a conversion in the shape is how they did it from a circle to a square. So they're just trying to say that there is a way that the microbes or the plant can kind of fix or stabilize the pollutant a little bit better, so it won't leach into the groundwater or through runoff get into the groundwater. Or it might be that there's some chelation going on where it's not so bioavailable. phytostimulation, this is the idea that you're using the microbes. So the plant will often excrete something from its roots. It encourages the right microbes to start to remediate the pollutant. So that's really the rhizodegradation, rhizoremediation, that would fit under phytostimulation. There's been a lot of work with this with hydrophobic compounds because remember the hydrophobic compounds tend to stick to the soil particles, but that's usually not a problem for microbes because microbes are able to get access to things that attach or stick to the soil. So phytostabilization and phytostimulation, definitely those won't impact herbivores very much. So if a bunny rabbit or a deer comes along and starts chewing on a plant that's doing this, really won't bother them because it's below ground. However, if you're thinking about what about phytoextraction, now we're talking about the idea that the pollutant in the soil is being brought up into the above ground tissue of the plant. It's extracted it from the soil. And then depending on what it does with that pollutant, then we could see that that could be a problem for any organism that wants to interact with that plant. So we see phytoextraction, that technique is used for heavy metals and other inorganics. And of course, if a bunny rabbit comes along and starts chewing on that leaf, it could be problematic. So if you are thinking about using plants for phytoremediation, you have to think about the ecology of the system. I would hope anyways that they do that, where they're paying attention to what else is going to be impacted if the plant is taking up these pollutants into the above ground biomass. All right, we'll continue on with that on Wednesday. So my goal is to get through the stress physiology content well enough so that the last day of the semester, we can just have a review session that day, because the exam's Monday of finals week.
Oh,
Yeah, Monday at noon.
be over.
Yeah, it'll be over quickly, but yeah, so I'm thinking Friday of the last Friday of class. I'm hoping we can reserve for a review session. That's my plan. Partly cumulative, which means